More on the situation with the vulnerable group. Joining us from Abuja studios, Mr. Victor Owoyomi, Senior Research Program Officer, Center for Citizens with Disabilities. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Just before we get to talking about access to COVID-19 vaccines, I'd like to know what impact the pandemic had on the vulnerable population, persons living with disabilities, especially since 2020. How much did life change?
Thank you for that question. Ordinarily, persons with disabilities are known to be facing a plethora of challenges prior to the advent of COVID-19. However, COVID-19, impacted negatively on their socioeconomic conditions and their psychosocial well-being. For instance, it increased hunger for many of them. Many of them lost their jobs because majority of them, from my research so far, are usually into informal sector of economy. And due to the impact of lockdown, many of them could not operate their different businesses. They were at home. A majority of them usually depend on caregivers. They depend on their dependents. And most of their dependents could not also go into their different economic activities. A majority of them also were affected psychologically. It increased their level of depression. It triggers schizophrenia among many of them, and it's also increased level of discrimination against persons with disability. So looking at the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the life of persons with disability, it has a negative impact on their socioeconomic conditions and psychological well-being.
So quite an impact from what you've just listed. But looking at your recent study, what was the major finding as to why persons living with disabilities have sort of been alienated from accessing available vaccines?
Yeah, from the Center for Citizens with Disability recent assessment on access to COVID-19 vaccine among persons with disabilities in Lagos State, we find out that majorly there is no synergy between Primary Healthcare Board and the Lagos State Office of Disability Affairs, which has further institutionalized discrimination against persons with disabilities. We also find out that there is no commitment so far on the part of the Lagos State government toward disability issues, which is also affecting their access to COVID-19 vaccine. And we also find out that majority of persons with disability have a lot of misconceptions about the safety and efficacy of this COVID-19 vaccine, and this is also discouraging many of them from accessing the vaccine. And also we find out that majority of those who have accessed the health facility for this vaccine face a lot of challenges like physical barriers, they face attitudinal barriers, they face the lack of ramps, they face communication barriers like lack of sign language interpreters at the health facility centers, and even the attitude of health workers towards many of them was not so friendly. Why? Because many of the health workers do not have adequate knowledge about disability issues, about disability rights, about disability needs. So because of all of these issues, many of them were discouraged from even accessing the vaccine. And because of the information out there that is not well, well tailored toward informing
not
them
a lot of
properly
sensitization. But Mr. Owoyomi, I just want you to
Yes.
wrap up in 30 seconds if you can. What are some of the changes that you'd like to see going forward, seeing as we've started another rollout of vaccines?
Yeah, thank you very much. Like the changes that would like to happen on the area of these vaccines, since they are rolling on the second phase, is that government should try as much as possible to remove every environmental, physical, and attitudinal barriers that is preempting PWD, person with disability, from accessing the COVID-19 vaccine. And government should also try as much as possible to train the health workers on how to respond competently to the needs and rights of persons with disabilities in Lagos State and across the nation.
All right. We'd like to thank you. A good 30 seconds there. Thank you so much, Mr. Victor Owoyomi, Senior Research Program Officer, Center for Citizens with Disabilities. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
We have more on the global response to the pandemic when we return. Please stay with us.